I'm Helen Pluckrose. I've just published Cynical Theories with James Lindsay, which is looking at the problem of social justice scholarship and activism and how it's affecting us. And I'm the editor of Aereo magazine, which I would love you all to read.
Hello and welcome to Spokes. I'm Colette Colfer.
Hello. I'm Terry.
He's the voice usually behind the scenes. If you're a regular, you'll notice that, well, first of all, you don't normally hear him. And second of all, that my voice sounds different. That's because I'm recording this introduction in a different place to usual. It's September 2020 and I've moved back to Waterford City in the southeast of Ireland for school and work. I did do the interview with Helen with our usual top-notch microphone, but this bit is from my laptop. So I'm in Waterford, and Terry, where are you?
Wild West Wicklow.
So hello to Wild West Wicklow. Helen Pluckrose has already introduced herself. In this episode, we mainly chat about the book Cynical Theories that she mentioned. She'll also touch on topics such as problems in academia, third level education, in the political left. Also, we'll talk about unconscious bias, group identity, the best way to tackle racism, Kafka traps, the rise of victimhood culture, and the importance of civil conversation. Just also to point out that the interview you're about to hear was recorded on a Sunday afternoon. I was in West Wicklow, where Terry is now, and Helen was in London. She was chatting to me from her home there, so you will hear some background Sunday afternoon household sounds on her microphone. So you've co-authored this book, Cynical Theories, with somebody called James Lindsay. Yeah. How do you and James know each other?
We took part in together. Well, we were writing together for quite a while before that, but we worked most closely together on the Grievance studies affair, as it was known, when we were quite concerned about some of the scholarship coming out of various sort of identity and cultural studies, and so we wrote some papers bringing together some of the worst ideas that we have ever, that we've come across, and used them to make really terrible arguments, and sent them to journals and got 7 of them accepted. And so now we have a lot of enemies because... So, but yeah, we first knew each other in the whole sort of new atheist moment, when we were quite critical of religion for its lack of evidence and its illiberal ethics. So this is really more of the same, but in a different direction.
Wow. Okay, so that's how you got to know each other first in the new atheist movement, and then that led into the Grievance studies, and from there into this book.
Yes.
So, I saw the Grievance studies, the hoax papers that you did in 2017, I think.
Yeah, we revealed it in October 2018.
And at the point when you did that, had you already got the plan in your mind for this book, Cynical Theories?
No, we hadn't, but we'd always been writing essays about it, and then after we finished the project, we wanted something to really break down and explain what we had been writing, what was out there, how it worked, and so that people could actually have a better understanding of what it was we did and why it matters.
Right, and why do you think it does matter?
I think it's a problem primarily for the humanities and for the political left, because it's working on a really shoddy epistemology. It's, how do we know what is true? And for us and for the majority of people, I think we know whether things are true to the best of our ability by how well they are evidenced. This isn't what is happening. Within this kind of scholarship, we're hearing that a reliance on evidence and reason and science and liberalism are all white Western male constructs that have been unfairly prioritised. So we think that that is quite a harmful attitude. Obviously, all kinds of arguments can be made, but we're going to defend evidence, reason and liberalism. So that is what we're doing against this really illiberal and irrational ideology that's getting far too much institutional power.
Yeah, it's quite intolerant, and like you point out in the book, it's spread far beyond the academy now. It's pretty much mainstream at the moment.
Yeah, it's definitely the dominant progressive ideology, and I don't think it is properly progressive at all. I think it's recreating old binaries and stereotypes that we had really advanced quite far in overcoming, which we still have to overcome. But this is taking us backwards, I think, in gender relations, in race relations, in the acceptance of LGBT rights. It's a really counterproductive system.
Actually, one of the points you make quite early on in the book is that it's feeding the far right.
I think it certainly is, yes. I mean, it's more. I don't think the far right exists because of this, obviously, but there's more than there's a reason that people are not voting left at the moment. Both America and the UK have seen catastrophic losses on the left. We didn't imagine that somebody like Donald Trump could appeal to enough Americans to become president, with Jeremy Corbyn having lost so many boroughs that have been red for so long. There's a real problem on the left, and I think that the social justice issue is absolutely central to that. It's undermining people's confidence in the left. We're not focusing on consistent principles. We're not liberal. We're not focusing on economic issues properly, and this is causing people, I believe, who are wavering in the middle to go right. It's one of the things that is causing it, and it's something we're definitely going to have to fix if I want, which I do, people to vote left again.
So it's alienating the working class, the traditional kind of left.
Yes, and people who are just more generally sort of liberal, reasonable, people who want consistent principles of non-discrimination, who want everything to be open to everyone. I mean, there's something really worrying if the right-wing parties, which have typically focused much more on hierarchy and limited access to various groups, is actually seeming to many people to be more inclusive and more consistent than the left. That's worrying.
I've been following you on Twitter for a few years, and one thing that I'm always amazed by is the speed at which you read. Am I right in thinking that you read a lot?
I do, yes. Yeah, I tend to devour books quite quickly.
So, and would you have read a lot of the theorists that you talk about in the book then, like Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard?
Yes, but it's better to think of me as going backwards. So yes, I have read the original postmodernists. I studied them at undergraduate, wrote about them at both undergraduate and postgraduate, but they're not my primary focus. What I am most interested in is the social justice scholarship that exists now, and they are citing those original postmodernists. You can trace it back very clearly to them, but what I'm reading in most volume is the feminist and critical race epistemologists, queer theorists, critical race theorists, fat activists, disability activists, because these are the ones who are really representing the evolution of those postmodern ideas about knowledge, language and power that are really affecting us right now.
Could I ask, do you have a favourite theorist?
People that I actually approve of, or the people I could identify as the most troubling?
I suppose ones that you enjoy and would approve of, yeah.
Yeah, my absolute idol is Mira Nanda. Now, she is a materialist post-colonial scholar. So she is Indian, and she looks at post-colonial India, how it is being affected politically, materially, economically. And she has been the staunchest critic of the postmodern approach, because she points out, quite rightly, that it's kind of perpetuating an Orientalism. So right at the centre of post-colonial theory is this idea of Orientalism, in which the West has constructed the East as superstitious and religious and illiberal and all these other things, so that the West can think of itself as scientific and rational. Now, that was an oppressive colonialist idea. The liberal attitude which has taken over is that no, science and reason and liberalism belong to absolutely everybody. Everybody can be ethical and reasonable. Everybody can be unethical and unreasonable. This isn't a reason. This is a racist distinction that was made by the colonialists. But what we're seeing in post-colonial theory is a maintaining of that distinction, a claim that science and reason do belong to the West, that liberalism does, that other ways of knowing belong to black and brown people, and that we need to appreciate them more. This is what all the talk of decolonising knowledge, decolonising the curriculum is about, and that I think that's quite appalling, and so does Meera Nanda, who argues consistently that actually, India and the rest of the world are also doing science. They're also using reason. They're not some superstitious. It's almost this sort of noble savage thing, and it's really, I think, deeply offensive and deeply harmful.
Talk to me. Talk to you. Talk to me.
In the subtitle to your book, it has How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender and Identity. And I wanted to ask, I know this is a kind of a deceptively simple question in a way, but I also think it can be quite, well, for me, I find it complex thinking about this. But what is identity?
Well, I think in the context that we're looking at it at the moment, it's what tribe you consider yourself to belong to. So for the identity scholars, the cultural scholars, identity is very much linked to immutable characteristics like race, sex, gender identity, sexuality, and trying to get a kind of political empowerment by focusing in a collected and organised way within those groups.
Right, so it moves beyond the individual. So I like the thing I think that confuses me is that if I identify as something doesn't necessarily mean I am something, or it's reified. You use that term actually in the book.
Yes, I think identity is something that is important to people, and I don't think there is any real problem. For somebody who is, say, a Black Brit, and they have a sort of pride in, say, a Nigerian heritage and also a British heritage and a certain type of music. This is what humans do. We identify with certain groups. There isn't a problem with that. What I see the problem as is the current critical social justice is putting so much social significance back into these categories. The liberal aim has always been to remove it. Who you are is important to you. You can tell your friends about it. You can tell people. You can identify with it. But nobody else can look at you and say, you're a woman. You should have this role in life. You're black. You should have that role in life. Everybody should have access to everything. And what we're seeing now is an explicit criticism of the idea that we need to focus less on identity and more on individuality and more on shared humanity, which was the essence of liberalism, wanting to reverse that and focus almost entirely on identity and power structures which arrange identities hierarchically. I think it brings out the worst of human nature.
And one of the things as well is about language and the power that language has. Now, I would often talk to people about this and I would say, well, there is an objective reality, but they might say, well, you only know that objective reality through the language that you use and the concepts that you have. So how do you respond to that when somebody says that?
Well, that's quite, that's true, but that truth is really quite banal, despite the fact that we have always been limited by the concepts we have and the words that we have to describe them, plus the reality that we cannot always convey everything as clearly as we mean to, and misinterpretations are something that are always going to happen. We have generally managed to communicate sufficiently in order to advance society in both scientific and technological ways and in the ways of human rights. The idea that we need to be careful with language, that it isn't perfect, that we can be biased, is certainly something we should hold on to, but something we should be aware of. But this utter despair of language and this feeling that knowledge is created by the way we talk about things, and now we have to really focus on how we talk about things and try to find the power dynamics within that and dig them out and dismantle them, is really making it extremely difficult for anybody to communicate, for anyone to feel comfortable and confident in raising a point that they have that could be problematic in the first place, and for them to be able to be authoritative over what they meant.
There's a kind of, I think, a lack of common sense in it.
Yes, there's certainly, there's this concept, we don't hear it a lot now, it was very much with the first postmodernists, the idea that we defamiliarise things because we just sort of take things for granted. A lot of the postmodern methodology was about looking at things anew, not assuming that they're just true, trying to step outside, defamiliarise yourself with it, and then try to look at it and what it's actually doing. So there can be certainly some value in that, but the extent to which it has been taken at the moment, when we have ridiculous situations, particularly in something like queer theory, where people are arguing that heterosexuality is a social construct, despite the fact that we're a sexually reproducing species. And I've said before that sometimes looking at the way that they're addressing things, it almost feels as though they are an alien species, an intelligent species, which has never encountered sexually reproducing animals before, and is looking at us and is trying to work out how it all works and what's going on. So it's quite frustrating.
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me with the hoax papers that you did, and in the video, Mike Nana's video, is the sense of humour. Like, you're having the crack. You're having a lot of laughs in the process. So was it actually fun doing those papers?
Most of it, I have to admit, was not fun. Mike called us. We all happened to be together when the first paper got in, and we'd just had a rather successful talk followed by several glasses of wine. So there was much hilarity that night, and we did have fun. We had some silly ideas, and it was all quite exciting. And then one of us had messaged the others going, "I know what we need to do. We need to do this." So there was a lot of fun in that, but mostly it was quite stressful. Jim read a lot of the theory and the feminist glaciology paper, a very, very famous one, which is just epitomizes the ridiculousness of it.
This one wasn't one of the hoax papers.
No, that was
right.
one.
So,
yeah. We wrote one of our astronomy papers, which they were still writing to us to ask us to revise it long after we'd revealed the hoax. So I don't know what had happened. But we based that on the feminist glaciology, and that was essentially an argument that a scientific look at glaciers was inadequate, and we needed feminist art projects and things to have a different kind of relationship with ice. It was just really silly. But Jim, his name, he works like a computer mostly, and that paper just short-circuited him. So for 2 days after that, he was saying to me, I can't carry on with this. I can't keep reading this stuff. I'm just about to despair of humanity. There's no hope in anything. So it was quite stressful a lot of the time, and it was quite a lot of work. I mean, it only took a couple of weeks to write each paper, which shouldn't be the case with actual solid scholarship. But there was a lot of reading and arguing, and it's not something I'd suggest many people would enjoy as a hobby.
So your aim in actually doing those grievance studies was to highlight that there was a problem in academia and in these journals.
Yeah, I mean, for me, a lot of the motivation was that when I was trying to address them straightforwardly, people would say that I didn't understand the theories or I hadn't read them. And or they would say that I was straw-manning them, and there are only a couple of mad papers out there. And so, yes, I wanted to take part in this project. I think if I can get published in these fields, then nobody can say that I don't understand the scholarship. I haven't read a lot of it. I don't know what I'm talking about. And it's going to be harder for people to say this isn't really a problem, because we'll have got right into the system. We'll have seen how the reviewers directed us to revise our papers. We'd know how it worked. We've got hundreds of citations, all of which we cited accurately. So yes, anybody who really wants to go into our papers and look at them in depth will find quite a goldmine of nonsense there, and that there is as far as I'm aware, there's a feminist geography group which is using it for that purpose, because they have similar concerns with the postmodern approach to their topic.
I think out of those grievance studies papers, the one that shocked me the most was the one where, now I'm not sure was this one the one that got published, or how far it got, where white male students were going to be sitting down in a lecture hall draped in chains.
Yes, that one had come back to us twice from Hypatia. We were having to rewrite it. So they'd said that they'd responded positively to it. They said that it was something they'd like to see implemented in the classroom, but we were still ongoing with trying to make all the theory meet their requirements. So we'd have got there, but they hadn't accepted it by the time we got found out. But that one was quite. That's one of the worst aspects of this. This is the idea of the progressive stack, which is a sort of hierarchical sorting system. So we had argued that people's identities should be rated. They should lose points for certain privilege things like being able-bodied or heterosexual. They should gain points for marginalised identities, and then the teacher should call upon people in order of their identity. So the people who are least privileged would be called on most. The most privileged would not be called on at all. Yes, there would be white men sitting on the floor in chains. Also, when they made a point, then they would be mocked and disbelieved, because this is believed that how women are responded to. So it was one of the darker and more sort of ugly sides of this kind of theory, which really doesn't have a lot of compassion for the average human.
I was looking in Ireland just before I chatted to you. I wanted to have a look at what's going on in Ireland, and how do we know if these theories and if they're being implemented in Ireland. I've no doubt that they are. So, I mean, there are inclusion and diversity workshops, and you can get a silver badge, a bronze badge, a gold badge, depending on how many of these courses you do. I think there's probably a lot of money in them as well. Mm-hmm. Where I work, there's unconscious bias workshops, which you have to do if you want to be on an interview panel. Now, I don't think, is that necessarily a problem? You know, what's the story with unconscious bias? Is it good for us to root out our unconscious biases, or?
I think it certainly is, but the unconscious bias tests and the way that it's done here are really quite thoroughly debunked. I've just my colleague Carrie Clark is currently compiled an enormous document of all the problems with unconscious bias, sort of scholarship and tests, because it doesn't actually work in the way that it's supposed to. So implicit bias tests don't actually measure how anybody's unconscious bias. There doesn't seem to be a connection. You cannot actually tell from what score somebody got in an implicit bias test as how racist, for example, their attitudes are. When people are asked explicitly, if somebody says that, yes, they do think one race is superior to another, this isn't going to necessarily be reflected in their implicit bias score. It doesn't even check out the same way on the same day. It depends.
So are they pointless then?
Yes, they're not only the tests have not been shown to work. They're sort of rigorous empirical social scientists have very little respect for this as a method. The first wave of tests showed some promise. Attempts to further them haven't. So one of the people, what's his name? I can send you some information about this because I haven't gone into it in enough detail myself, but as I said, my colleague has, and there's a huge document that we're going to present for people who want to challenge this at work. But the people who have developed these tests have had to admit that they don't actually work for detecting unconscious bias. The training in actually addressing unconscious bias seems to either have no effect at all or to make people more racist, more conscious of race, and so triggering hostility in what had been previously a more sort of cooperative work environment. It's all still quite new, but there isn't any reason to think the implicit association test tests what it thinks it does, or that there is anything valuable about this kind of training, and it might even be counterproductive.
Right. That is kind of the idea, that we're categorizing people constantly, and the Martin Luther King, for example, the ideal was to move beyond seeing color, whereas now it's like put everybody into their box depending on what their skin color is. So it's more divisive than unifying.
Yeah, I mean, the two approaches, I think, both the liberal approach and the critical social justice approach, they both accept that we have not entirely overcome all of our biases. There are stereotypes which associate with women, with people of colour, and these do need to be continued to be dismantled. But whereas the liberal approach would continue to not see race, to not discriminate by race, and to frown upon anybody who is doing that, the sort of critical race theory approach wants us to always think about race all the time, and to look into every situation as though there is a racial bias there. Their rationale is that unless we are constantly attuned to racism, we won't see it. There'll be plausible deniability. I just didn't employ that person for, some other reason. It's just a coincidence that I've never accepted a black candidate. But in reality, we can measure these things. We can approach them with a consistent and liberal stance. There isn't yet any reason to think that the identity politics approach decreases racist attitudes any more than the liberal approach does. I think it will soon be quite clear that the liberal approach actually does considerably better with reducing racism.
I mean, there is the question, of course, as well, that as human beings, can we ever be really unbiased towards things? Like, our life experience is going to, we're going to end up having some level of biases depending probably on what experiences we've had in life or what we've been exposed to. So I don't know, as humans, we're flawed anyway, aren't we?
I think there's always going to be a lot of individual bias. I think the critical social justice approach doesn't take that into account at all. It really looks at group biases. And I think there's always going to be an in-group and out-group. So psychological studies which have looked at at this have found that if you tell humans that they are in certain groups with other humans they haven't met before, they will, within a few minutes, start to have a more positive perspective of those in their own team and a negative one of the other team. And this is almost certainly a very hardwired animal instinct that we have and that we have evolved for good reason. So I think there is a need to recognise that we have that and to try to mitigate it. But this is where I think the critical social justice approach falls down. The liberal humanist approach wants us to try to push out who it is we see as our team. So we stop just thinking, well, it's only the white people, it's only the Christians, it's, we expand that to a wider range of humanity, and we try not to make divisions and let anywhere we can help it. But the critical social justice approach is taking entirely the opposite position, and it isn't banking on human nature, which is going to produce warring tribes. It might be a wonderful ideal for us to just hope that humans could overcome this and to come together to defeat racism, even when we're being divided by race with negative qualities attributed to one. But I don't think that's a realistic possibility. I think the reason that the activism of people like Martin Luther King was so successful because it was universal. It wasn't saying we are a certain people, we have an experience, we have been oppressed by you as a group. It was, you have this, you're human, we don't have this, we're also human. Can we not expand this? And that, I think, appeals to the human sense of fairness.
Cynical theories.
Can I come back to Ireland, actually? I want to, for people who are listening in Ireland to the discussion, that in the wake of the death of George Floyd, or the killing of George Floyd in America in May, on my Facebook timeline, a lot of people I knew were talking about white privilege and white fragility. Now, I wanted to engage in discussion with them. I was aware of your work and I knew that they were linking into critical race theory, but it became really difficult for me to do it, because if I did it, the danger was that then people would label me as racist. But I wanted to make the point that Ireland's history is so utterly different to the history of America that we understand race in Ireland in a very different way. So have you any tips for how to deal with it when people start saying that you've got to address your white privilege and your white fragility in that sense? I
think a very simple response is needed, in which I do not share those premises. As you point out, the critical race theory has been produced in a very specific American context, in which black people and white people shared a country, but the black people were either enslaved or subordinated class. This is something that isn't going to be overcome immediately. This is something that is going to be being worked through for some considerable time. For the UK, it's a different situation. We also oppressed lots of minority groups, but the people who were oppressed by the British Empire don't actually usually live here. So we have a different attitude to address. In Ireland, of course, you were colonised for 800 years by the British, and so this is a different situation again, but the critical race theory doesn't really allow for this kind of nuance. It would still insist on telling somebody, an Irish person who perhaps had never read anything of critical race theory or was not particularly familiar with an American context, would still insist that they had nevertheless been socialised into white supremacy and this whole sort of very simplistic system.
Yeah, and one of the things that really struck me was my friends who were saying this stuff were the most non-racist people that I know. I mean, they're actively anti-racist, and they're constantly trying to make the world a better place in whatever community groups they might be in. And next thing, they're coming out and they're saying, "Oh, okay, look, I'm involved in this in racism because I'm white." And I'm trying to say to them, no, you're not necessarily, But it becomes a difficult kind of conversation to have, I think, because it's seen as the only way to look at it today. And if you challenge it, well, that means you're part of it.
Yeah, that we've got the whole sort of Kafka trap in there, where the system is set up. You have the choice of being either racist and in denial, or racist and self-aware enough to recognise that you are and to be doing the work of dismantling your white privilege. So there is a real incentive there to pretend to be racist or convince yourself that you must be, but you just haven't been aware of it because you have that privilege that keeps you from being aware of these assumptions that you have. If you try to disagree from a different perspective, then you will be accused of taking, Robin DiAngelo calls it a variety of defensive moves. So according to DiAngelo, to be anybody who responds to being confronted with their own racism as a white person, if they disagree, go away or stay quiet, those are all signs of fragility. It's a defensive move because you don't want to confront your complicity in racism. The only way to not be fragile is to remain there and verbally agree that that is the case. So this is totally unfalsifiable. There's no way out of this where you can legitimately disagree. If you read DiAngelo, her book just essentially shuts down every kind of escape route anybody could possibly have for arguing that they are not socialised into this racist ideology.
But would she just say, like, is according to DiAngelo, is every white person racist? Is it that extreme?
No, because it's nothing to do with the individual, because society is racist. So she would say that every white person who has been born and raised in a white dominant society like America, like the UK,
and Ireland,
has been socialised into this this kind of racial understanding of the world. She says it is absolutely impossible to have avoided it. You cannot help but take on these assumptions, and that is what she believes that everybody will do. I mean, Jim had this wonderful meme sent to him, and it has Freud at the top saying, "I see, it's not that I want to have sex with my mother, it's that everybody wants to have sex with their mother." And then we have DiAngelo saying, "See, it's not that I'm racist, it's that everybody's racist." But if you read through White Fragility and other work of DiAngelo, what she does is she tells you assumptions that she herself has made. So when she was going to a party and she thought at first that everybody else at the party that she was going to was black, and she felt unsure of herself and out of place, then that isn't just her perspective. It wasn't that she was particularly racially aware, and it must be that all white people would feel like that if they were a minority in a room, and you just can't argue with that.
And her book is like in the bestsellers, I would imagine, in Ireland, but it's definitely up there in Amazon and America, the UK. Is it in the UK? Would it be? Yeah.
Yeah. It was. So it was for over 6 months. It was in the New York Times bestseller list. Then it sold out again after the killing of Mr. Floyd. So it's it's a very, very popular one because it's clear, because it's simple. It gives people something they can do. So quite a few critical race theorists aren't actually that keen on DiAngelo. They think she's focusing again too much on white people, and it's not actually looking at the writings and the theories of African Americans. So that's an interesting point, because it isn't that everybody in critical race theory has taken the DiAngelo approach. Ibram Kendi, for example, has quite a different approach. He retains some confidence in the individual who can choose to believe or not believe racist ideas, to support or not support racist policies. There's an entirely different set of problems associated with him. He is quite authoritarian, but he's not coming from the postmodern discourse perspective that D'Angelo is.
I actually saw he has a book in the bestsellers in Amazon, which is for how to make your baby anti-racist.
Yeah.
Or toddlers, and there was one for adults then as well. Okay, so that's there. So there's two different kind of strands of critical race theory. Then one is postmodern, and one is not necessarily so postmodern.
Yeah, I mean, with the most sort of scholarly theorists, there's a materialist side and a postmodern side. So you have somebody like Derek Bell, who was a materialist. And so he would have considered himself to be evidence-based, and he would be looking at systems in sort of material systems, government, law, politics. So they're not focused so much on attitudes and biases. So
right. So would you? Sorry, can I ask then? Would you be more in favour of that materialist stance then, or is it all? Or would you be critical equally of it?
It's a different kind of criticism. So the materialist critical race theorists are the radical feminists, are what the radical feminists are to the trans activists. So you see we've got these two different strands. We've got the materialists who come from the Marxist tradition, and they see class, things in terms of class, whether it's actually economic class or it's a class of men and a class of women, and there's one oppressing the other. And so you get... with them, you get an appreciation for objective reality, you get a reasoned argument, but you also get this kind of conspiracy mentality, which is a different problem from the one we see with the postmodern. So the postmodern feminists will be the intersectionals and the queer theorists. They will take a position you see the opposition mostly when you've got the radical feminists who are referred to as TERFs and the trans activists who are coming from a queer theory perspective. So this is the oppositions that run throughout the different kinds of theory. Sorry,
yes,
I know.
No, honestly, I've been fascinated by and taken up with looking at gender in the last few years. And so I'm pretty aware of the different things. And I've been called a TERF because I do think biology matters, but I'm not a radical feminist. No. I'm very much in favour of trans people having rights, but it's a very difficult discussion to even engage in because, like, if you take one viewpoint, you're accused of one thing. If you take another, you're accused of another. But I actually think there's a generational divide as well. I'm of an age where gender, it just wasn't a thing when I was growing up. Like the concept of gender was just like you were a man or a woman, where it became an identity way more recently. And I think from I see teenagers now and people in their 20-somethings, and they look at me like I'm a dinosaur, and I'm trying to understand their perspective, but it's so different. You know?
Yeah, I mean, that was why I wanted to bring up the difference between the rad femmes and the trans activists, because I think that does show the divide and the way it works in various different ways. But with the radical feminists, we've got this position where women are a biological class that are oppressed by men as a biological class because of their reproductive systems. So you will hear really quite from the radical feminists, not from everybody who calls themselves gender critical, but you'll hear this quite complicated conspiracy theory about how trans women and those who support their rights are actually men's rights activists who are trying to support the patriarchy by giving men, which they consider trans women to be, access to women's spaces and even women's identities. So you can see this kind of conspiracy mentality where you must believe the same thing as me, otherwise you're part of this horrible oppressive system. But then we have the trans activists who are coming from a queer theory approach, and they take a very different perspective. They see gender as something that is both important and socially constructed. So they want people to be able to choose their own gender, to not be put in any boxes, because it comes from queer theory, and there's this idea that it's the existence of solid categories that oppress people. And so we need to be particularly supportive of those who don't fit neatly into feminine woman attracted to men or masculine man attracted to women. And so we have this this kind of war where the trans activists will call the gender critical feminists TERFs and transphobes, and the gender critical feminists will call the trans activists misogynists. And then in the middle, there's the liberals who are saying, look, trans people are really vulnerable and they need some support. Women also need their own spaces and to be able to compete fairly in sports. Can we not please just try to have a conversation here without this being a zero-sum issue? But I don't think that there will ever be a bridge between those two. And that's the worst of it.
I think that might mean that I'm a liberal.
Yes.
I don't know. But like, can you? In some ways, it's like they're speaking different languages, and because it's different languages, they can't actually understand the different languages because it's ideas that are so different.
Yes, they're working on different frameworks.
Yeah. So, can you see any solution to that?
I think that the liberal one, as I'm saying, if that can see both of their positions. I just wrote a piece for Aereo called "The Need for Ideological Theory of Mind." And I used those two groups. If they understood each other's framework and were prepared to use a little bit of charity, then some kind of conversation could happen. So I think that the solution to this kind of hyper-polarized divide, which is driven by narratives which are just completely opposed and people not being able to get into each other's, I think this can best be opposed by the rest of us, which I still believe is the majority, trying to renormalize an expectation of charity, of reasoned argument, of evidence, of trying to be kinder, trying to be more honest and more open, and actually valuing discussion, trying to understand what the other person actually means.
Is it an important element of that? I just wonder, is it to get away from this idea of a kind of an oppression competition? I'm oppressed. No, I'm more oppressed. No, that group is even more oppressed. Do you think we need to get away from that entirely, or is that important that we do take that into consideration?
I think we're seeing a very unhealthy understanding of victimhood at the moment. Yeah, the best book for this is Campbell and Manning's The Rise of Victimhood Culture, where we're seeing that there's now a sort of an attachment of virtue and status to somebody who is considered to have conflicting marginalized identities that are sort of compounding each other because they are believed to have access to knowledge which isn't part of the mainstream discourse. So they can see and understand mainstream discourse because they have to live in it, but they also have extra knowledge and experience and perception because of their position in society in relation to this. So they are given a kind of both more status and respect as somebody who can know things on more levels, but also a kind of compensatory privilege, almost in a way, that because you have been so multiply oppressed, you must now be considered authoritative and protected. So it's really quite horrible.
Yeah, and it takes away an individual agency. I mean, people tell me I'm oppressed because I'm a woman. I'm like, no, I'm not oppressed. So, although I do understand the biological reality, I get that argument, and I would be, I would support that argument. But at the same time, I don't get this like pervasive misogyny and the patriarchy idea. So, I better let you go. It's a Sunday afternoon, even though this probably won't go out until later in the week because Terry will put in some music. Is there any, just one last question, what can we do? I mean, I think your book is so important. I think that is a step that's kind of putting a cog in the wheel and that might stop it or slow it down. But is there anything else that we can do do you think?
I think we can just try to be more accepting of other ideas as far as we can. You know, if you're a left-wing person, then try to have some charity and some understanding for people on the right, and vice versa, so that we can try and reduce the polarization. The ideal society is one in which an ethical and reasonable right is in negotiation with an ethical and reasonable left. That isn't what we've got at the moment. We've got full-out war and lack of communication. So anything that will help us to get back to genuine communication across political divides is something I think we should be doing.
That's it for this episode of Spokes, with thanks to our guest Helen Pluckrose. If you like our work, please do subscribe.
Please like and subscribe and share the video.
There is no video.
Podcast!